bitter. All right, well, good. We're through Ruth, and now we're up to First Samuel. First Samuel, and honestly, I tried to figure a way that we could do First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, each together, but they are so different, and they tell such different stories, and they give such different information. We've got to take them book at a time. The author of First Samuel is unknown. Many historians credit Samuel himself or Nathan or Gad, who were recorders. Most likely it was written between 931 and 792 BC, so somewhere in that 140-year period. The key verse is going to be chapter 8 and verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." You'll remember that this was at the point where the people cried out for a king. They weren't listening to the judges. They didn't follow what the judges told them. And so they simply cried out for a king. And Samuel was very distraught over that. But the Lord said, "It's not you they've rejected, it's me. So don't worry about it." The book is named after the man of God, the man whom God used to establish Israel's kingship. But the book also tells us much more than just who it is God had ordained as king. It establishes the truth that Jehovah is Israel's true ruler. It reminds them over and over again that God is the one who is in charge, that God is their sovereign, God is their ruler. In the earliest Hebrew manuscripts, 1st and 2nd Samuel were one book. But the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and the Latin Vulgate and the English version have followed the Septuagint by breaking it into two books. The first book of Samuel begins with spiritual stability in Israel. But that spiritual stability was deteriorating. As a matter of fact, it ends up being the lowest point in their history. And the main theme of Israel's choice of a king, abandoning God's best for the nation, is the focus. They were neglecting everything that God would provide for them. Now, some of the things that marked Israel at this time were these four things. There was a corrupt priesthood. The priesthood was corrupt. You see that in chapters 2 and chapters 22 to 26. One of the more prominent names that you will see in the early part of 1 Samuel is Eli. Eli was a priest of God, but Eli was a kind of a passive priest. He didn't rule very well. He was a passive leader, so much so that his two sons, Phinehas and Hophni, were wicked, evil men who robbed from the people, and Eli did nothing. He simply turned his head and looked the other way. And so you see the corrupt priesthood. The second reality is the absence of the Ark of the Covenant. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes as we look at chapters 4, 5, and 6. But this is a prominent thing. The Ark of the Covenant is no longer with the people. And what did the Ark of the Covenant represent? Well, that they were there. It represented the presence of God, that he was with them. He said, "This is where I will meet you." And so they had neglected the presence of God. A third thing, Israel practiced idolatry with regularity. They were idol worshipers. They would bring in all the foreign gods, the pagan gods, and they would worship them as well as Jehovah. And then the fourth thing was dishonest judges. Dishonest judges. They were simply corrupt. And so these are four major points, and you'll see them as you read through. Now, there are some words and phrases that are prominent in the book. Um, they give us a little bit of help, if you will, in remembering what's in the book, and these are what they are. One phrase that goes over and over 5 times is the phrase, the Lord of hosts. The Lord of hosts. God is called the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the mighty army, the Lord of the mighty ones. So he is the Lord of hosts. The second word or phrase is Ichabod. Does anybody remember what it means? Ichabod, the glory has departed. The glory has departed. Again, we'll tell you why in just a couple minutes. And then a third name, Ebenezer. We sing the song, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," right? And in that, there's that phrase, "Here I raise mine Ebenezer." You've sung that?
Yeah.
It means that the Lord has helped us. The Lord has helped us. So now when you sing that, you know what you're saying. You realize, the Lord has helped us. Here I raise my banner that says, God has been my help. Fourth thing, the word of the Lord was precious. The word of the Lord was precious. It was rare for the Lord to speak specifically to his people in those days. And that's why the word of the Lord was precious. It was something to be valued and treasured. Now, the book can be broken down into 3 basic sections as it follows 3 particular men. And so you look at those sections, it follows Samuel, who was the last of the judges. That's chapters 1 to 8. It follows Saul, who was the first king, chapters 9 to 15. And by the way, we find out there when we come to Saul being chosen, he was not God's choice. We recognize that, right? He was the people's choice. They said, "We want a king." And they saw him standing head and shoulders above everybody else. And they said, "Well, it's got to be him." And so it was their choice, but it was not God's choice. And then the book follows also David, who is the anointed successor of Saul. And that's chapters 16 to 31. All right, let's break it down a little bit. Let's look at that first section. Samuel, who is the last of the judges. Samuel was born to Hannah, whose husband was Elkanah, who was an Ephraimite of the tribe of Ephraim. You'll remember that Ephraim was descended from Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. Samuel's ministry marks the beginning of the office of prophet. He is the first prophet of Israel. And there was a period of about 20 years where Samuel really is not mentioned at all. Chapters 3 through 7, 4 through 7. And the emphasis in those chapters is on the Ark of the Covenant. It's not so much about the office of the prophet, but it's about the presence of God in the Ark of the Covenant. Samuel continued to serve as a judge as well until Saul's kingship in chapter 10. And again, Samuel was dejected when the people rejected the Lord. You can remember that. I gave you a little bit of a rhyme. He was dejected when they rejected the Lord as their king. All right, so that's Samuel. The second section, beginning in chapter 9, deals with Saul, who is the first of the kings of Israel. When Israel chose to be led by a king, they were abandoning God's best for the nation. They were abandoning what God had ordained for them. And so they anointed Saul, who was of the tribe of, anybody remember? Benjamin. Okay, it's right there, so you ought to know. Now, there were several acts that marred the rule of Samuel. And I've given you 3. There are actually a few more, but in chapter 15, we see an act of rebellion. This is an act of rebellion. You've heard me tell the story before of hacking Agag to pieces. Um, uh, Saul went to war against the Amalekites. God said, destroy everything and everyone, but Saul spared the king. He said, and he's also spared some of the best of the cattle. We were going to offer a sacrifice to the Lord, and this is the best we could do. And Samuel said, hey, God's more into obedience than he is to sacrifice. And so this is where you get this. This was an act of rebellion, just didn't do what God said, and he spared the king Agag. The second act is an act of jealousy. An act of jealousy. This is in chapter 18, where he tried to kill David on several occasions. And you're familiar with most of that, but this was an act of jealousy. And the third one I've given you in chapter 28 is an act of apostasy. An act of apostasy, apostasy, if you're wondering. Apostasy. This is when he went and consulted the witch of Endor. And God had told him, have nothing to do with mediums, have nothing to do with the occult. Don't seek after that wisdom, but seek the Lord. You also had, along there, you had an act of cowardice. This is in chapter 31, where he took his own life in battle. He was injured, but then he said to his armor bearer, said, you kill me, run me through with my spear, and the guy wouldn't do it. And so Saul did it for himself. So this was an act of cowardice. He committed suicide. So Samuel's the last of the judges. Saul is the first of the kings. But David is the anointed successor, and we read mostly about him in chapters 16 to 31. By the way, David does not become king until 2 Samuel 5. And so what we see is he is God's chosen successor, but he is living under the authority of King Saul. And he recognized Saul as God's sovereign leader. And he was not going to rebel against that, even though there were a couple of occasions where David had the opportunity that he could have killed Saul. You remember that time that David went into the cave and he was hiding back in the back parts of the cave, and Saul came in to go to the bathroom, and David had an opportunity. He could have killed him, but he cut off the corner of his robe. His companions were saying, go and kill him. The Lord's given him into your hand. He said, no, God's not giving me into his hand. I can't touch the Lord's anointed one. And so he didn't kill him. There was another occasion where he had the opportunity, but he did not kill him. So David was chosen by God through Samuel to be the successor of Saul. And he was anointed king at Bethlehem, chapter 16 and verse 4. David was the youngest of 8 sons to Jesse. And all of the sons came through, and they were handsome, they were rugged, they were strong, they were mighty men. But each time Samuel said, no, that's not the one. David's notable defining moment was his victory over Goliath. His victory over Goliath, chapter 17. He had a strategy from God how to fight. And it wasn't with the weapons of war that Saul gave to him to put on, but it was with just a simple sling and a rock. And it kind of reminds us that God has given us weapons of war. We read about them in Ephesians chapter 6. The helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit, the feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, prayer. We have all this as our weapons of war. And we don't need to use anything else that the world might suggest, but we follow after what God has given us. Well, while David was hated by Saul, he was loved by Jonathan. He was loved by Jonathan. That was Saul's son. And that was really a sticking point for Saul as well when he found out about it. He found out that Jonathan was helping David get away. and it really didn't sit well with him. But when you think of how he ran, how David was constantly being chased, sought after by Saul, when you read Psalm 59, that was written while David was being hunted by Saul. And if you read the passage in 1 Samuel in chapter 16 to 31, you read all those accounts of Saul hunting after David. Now Psalm 59 makes a little more sense to you. And then also, while David was being hunted, also Psalm 56 was written when he took refuge among the Philistines. This was a point where he feigned insanity and went over with the Philistines just so he could get away from Saul. So he has this defining moment of victory with Goliath, and he has this special relationship with Jonathan, Saul's son. Now, just to hit a little bit, turn with me to chapter 4. Turn with me to chapter 4, and let's look at 4, 5, 6, and 7. We'll do this real quickly. Because again, David is not yet king, and even though he's hounded by Saul, even given opportunities to kill him, he is still recognizing the authority of Saul. But let's go back to even before that. Let's go back when Samuel was still the judge and the people were not following him. In chapter 4, the battle lines are drawn between Israel and the Philistines, but the Philistines rout them. And so all of Israel is now questioning, why? Why have we been routed by our enemies? And the answer comes because the Ark of the Covenant is no longer with you. You have let it go. And the Philistines, although they were winning, they were still afraid of Israel because they knew Israel's history. They knew how God had delivered them out of Egypt. They knew how God had delivered them in victory after victory after victory. And so the Philistines were a bit leery. Eli was the judge before Samuel. Eli was the judge. He was 98 years old. He heard the noise of the battle, and news of the battle comes. The runner comes and says, your sons Phinehas and Hophni have been killed in the battle. And then he adds this phrase, and the Ark of the Covenant has been taken. So it was the absence of the Ark of the Covenant with the people of God that brought their demise. And when Eli heard the news, he fell off his seat backwards, broke his neck, and died. Meanwhile, his daughter-in-law, the wife of Hophni, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she gave birth, she named him Ichabod, because she too had heard that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken. And Ichabod means the glory has departed. So now you're getting the picture, and it's all fitting together. Chapter 6, the Philistines have now captured the Ark. They've got the Ark. And they moved the Ark of the Covenant into the temple of their god, Dagon. Dagon, this big, tall structure idol that they worshipped. The next morning when they woke up, Dagon had fallen flat on his face, and the Ark of the Covenant was still standing. The next morning, they came in again, and Dagon had fallen again. His head and his hands were now removed, and he's lying across the threshold. And they all rushed in and said, Dagon. It's a bad dad joke, but I had to throw it in. Which was a reminder that God is the true God, not Dagon. And so he had conquered him. So God's hand falls heavily upon the Philistines. He ravages them with tumors, and the tumors just eat them up. And so they're saying, okay, what do we got to do? The Ark of God can't stay here. And so they moved it to Gath. Gath was the home of, anybody remember? Goliath. Goliath was from Gath. And so disaster followed when they moved it to Gath. And then they said, well, okay, it's going bad at Gath, so we'll move it to Ekron. And the people at Ekron said, no, don't bring it here. We don't want it. But they moved it to Ekron, and again, trouble followed. Now we come to chapter 6. The Ark of the Covenant is in the hands of the Philistines. And after 6 months, I don't know why they waited 6 months with all the disaster that was around the Ark of the Covenant. But they waited 6 months, and the priests and the diviners all got together, and they said, what do we do? What do we do? And they said, well, send the ark away. But don't send it empty. You need to put in a guilt offering, because, I mean, they knew something about the worship of God, Jehovah, and so they wanted to give an offering. And that guilt offering was going to be 5 golden tumors, representing their sickness, and 5 golden mice. Why 5 of each? Because that's the number of lords of the Philistines there were, leaders of the Philistines. And so they said, okay, we're going to make a new cart, brand new wood. We're going to get 2 milch cows with their calves, but we're going to take the calves away from them. I'm not a farm boy, but if you take cows that have just had calves, they aren't going to be very happy if you take the calves away from them. Yeah. And so they said, this is how we're going to send them off. And if they go straight to Beth Shemesh, then we'll know that all of this came from God. But if they kind of just wander through the wilderness, wander through the desert, then we'll know it just happened by accident. Well, you know what happened? They went straight to Beth Shemesh. And when they got to Beth Shemesh, the people there broke up the cart, made an altar and a burnt offering sacrifices, offered the cows as the offering. And then the Levites took the ark and they looked into it. They weren't supposed to do that. You're not supposed to look inside. You're supposed to carry it on poles on your shoulders and not touch it and not look inside. And God struck down 50,070 men. 50,000 men lost their lives because of this disgrace. Which brings us to chapter 7. They sent a message to Kiriath Jearim, which was a place where the ark was supposed to be. And they said, come get the ark. And the ark stayed in Kiriath Jearim for 20 years. Look at chapter 7 and verses 3 and 4. Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord with all your heart, remove the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and direct your hearts to the Lord and serve him alone, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. And so the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord alone. This is a recommitment. They determined to serve the Lord alone. But then the Philistines come again. They gathered together against them at Mizpah, and they went up to Israel, but they were afraid. And the Israelites were afraid too. The Philistines are coming after us again. What are we going to do? So they called Samuel and they said, Samuel, pray for us. And he did. And he offered a burnt offering. And the Lord brought thunder that confused the Philistines, and Israel routed them again. And look at verse 12. Then Samuel took a stone and named it Ebenezer, saying, thus far the Lord has helped us. This is just a reminder to us. And oftentimes we wander, and we have a tendency to sometimes forsake the Lord. But he says, if you return to me with a broken spirit, a contrite heart, I will be with you. And he gives us a reminder of all the times that the Lord has been with us and the Lord has helped us. And therefore we can raise our Ebenezer and give praise to the Lord. Long story, but just a reminder of how God was moving and working among Israel and how they were wandering from him. But he is faithful to those who trust him and follow him. A few things to remember. Hannah, the wife of Elkanah, the mother of Samuel, um, she received a double portion of Elkanah's sacrifice. Um, as you read the opening chapter of First Samuel, Hannah is barren. She cannot bear children, but Elkanah has a second wife by whom he is having children. And he says, I'm not in the place of God. I can't do anything about that. But finally, God heard her prayer as she went before Eli and said, if the Lord gives, or before Samuel, excuse me, if the Lord gives me, I was right, Eli, if the Lord gives me a son, I will give him back to the Lord. And after that, number two, Hannah had 3 more sons and 2 more daughters after she dedicated Samuel to the Lord. There is a parallel between Samuel and Jesus. You can read that parallel in chapter 2 and verse 26, where it says, now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor with both God and with man. You'll remember in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, it says the same thing about Jesus. He was growing in favor with God and with man. So there's your parallel. Number 4, David would not kill Saul because he was the Lord's anointed. I won't touch him. And then number 5, Saul and his 3 sons were killed in the battle with the Philistines in chapter 31. When we read through 1st and 2nd Samuel and we read the history of Israel and their wars and their battles, their kings, and then you get to 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is pretty much a reiteration of the kings of Israel. It just reminds us again of how badly things can go when we forsake the way of the Lord, when we abandon his ways and go our own way. And so I hope as we read through and as we study through, we will learn those lessons to trust the Lord and do things his way for his glory.